Ja, meine Damen und Herren.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the last panel of our theme days, Narratives of War. I'm happy that you're still here, bearing with us. Let me first say something about this special final panel before I introduce the panelists. Bearing Witness is the title of this last panel, which distinguishes itself from the other themes and questions which we have discussed for the past 3 days. A program as this on narratives of war cannot be concluded. We cannot subsume it into a comfortable insight, a reduced knowledge, a consoling agreeing. We can talk about war like this. Such a program can and has to raise questions which leave you quite irritated, with doubts, insecure, without undermining the ethical urge of having to tell the story, of wanting to tell the story. Such a program wants and has to close the shelter for those who are morally indifferent. Such a program wants to avoid at least that people withdraw to the position of an alleged innocence of not knowing. And that is why, with our last panel, we don't want to close the circle. We rather want to open the circle and widen the horizon. More away from the concrete wars, which we discussed in the last days, and the question how these current or past wars can be narrated. We now want to focus on the question of bearing witness of violence, of extreme experience, inside and outside of closely defined or confined wars. And for that, I would like to welcome my guests. To my right, Professor Ulrich Baer. He's a professor for German literature and comparative literature at the New York University. Warm welcome. I'm happy that you're here. To my left, Philip Gourevitch, whom you've met already, and he's like a mascot here because he was on the panel and of many panels and made their contributions. Philip Gourevitch is a journalist, author, editor. I'm happy that you're here. A warm welcome. And Liao Yiwu, next to Philip Gourevitch, he's a writer, poet, musician, and here in Germany we left quite an impression with several books, and very special to me, it will be about the book with his witness, his testimony from Chinese prisons, published in the Fischer Verlag, For a Song and 100 Songs. I'm happy that you're here, Liao Yiwu. And my co-moderator, whom you've also met, Martin Bogner. Philip, if I recapitulate what we've discussed in the past days, we discussed about who narrates. We talked about how this narration can be done. We just talked about the limits of understanding, the limits of what can be told. What we hardly ever discussed the question I would like to ask now, for whom do we narrate if you report from various regions, but from regions in which there are people who were tortured, who suffered, people who are no longer there, people who survived but are injured and hurt. As a witness who travels to these regions where there are still these traces of violence, and which are enshrined in all these different languages. For whom are you a witness of violence or wars?
I have no idea. I don't think about it at all. I'm not sure I've never really liked this phrase bearing witness because it seems a little self-aggrandizing. It suggests that one is doing something. There's an implied sort of noble cause to it. You know, I have come to bear witness, however hard it is for me. I go to observe. I go to record. I go to answer questions. I guess I'm going for myself first, and I'm going on the wild presumption that what's really interesting to me is interesting, and that a lot of the things that I have found interesting to read and to see, and the books and the works of people whose work I've admired over time, has been interesting to me. I don't know that they had me in mind. I don't have anybody in mind. I don't know why anybody should be interested in Rwanda or would be interested in Rwanda, why anybody would be interested in writing about James Brown except they like his music, but I'm not writing about it simply for people who like his music. That's different from when I cover the presidential election in the United States. I have a pretty good idea who's interested, which is voters. But when I'm covering the stories of faraway wars, I'm going because I have a bunch of, I'm going because of things that I don't understand and things that I want to draw a little bit closer to. I'm going because I find that it pushes out, that confronting things that confuse one is fruitful.
Nun beschreiben Sie.
You describe, if I ask, for whom do you tell the story? So there are two possible directions with which I mean for whom, and that's what you answered. To whom it is directed, to whom is my narration, what you write is directed. The other question, how you can understand for whom is it, backwards. The question, if, for example, you are in Rwanda and there are people who share with you their experience, or people you've met, to whom you've talked, who then became victim of atrocities, violations, whether they were expelled or were murdered. I would like to know whether, in this sense, you narrate for somebody, on behalf of somebody. So you do it on behalf of the people whom you've met in Rwanda, of whom you know, who might not have the opportunity to give a narration. They might not have the intention, as you have, who have disappeared. So for whom, on behalf of whom do you tell the story?
Well, yes, sure. I'm certainly trying to bring stories from people who might not have any larger way to amplify them or tell them to others. But I'm reluctant to make a claim that that's what I'm really out there to do. That's a benefit of what I do. That's one of the services that I perform.
Weil Sie es nicht so empfinden.
Because you don't feel, or because you don't think it's your job?
I'm trying to write good writing. I'm a writer. If I were a songwriter, I could make all kinds of claims about how I'm trying to heal the world and feed the hungry, but none of that matters if I'm not trying, first of all, to write a good song. And I'm a writer, and so when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about how to write a story that moves me, that connects things, that brings together thoughts and ideas, that people I'm talking to, and I'm going to confront reality and to take that relationship with reality to bring that back through those stories. But I don't think of it like I am going to give voice to the voiceless. I don't know. Maybe I will. I remember, maybe this will help. There's one of the very first long pieces of reportage I did was for Granta magazine in 1994, just before I started to go to Rwanda, and I went to do the stories of Vietnamese boat people who were still lost in refugee camps around the South China Sea. And they were stuck. They were people who had left Vietnam at a time when it was still the world's policy that if you got out by boat, you were a refugee. And they had landed on the perimeters of the South China Sea a couple weeks later, and in those 2 weeks, a rule had come down saying, no, you're not. If you now land, you're an economic migrant and you face forced repatriation. So they'd put everything for years into this flight. And they'd arrived in this place, and now they'd spent 3, 4, 5 years basically in detention in these camps. And I went to do these interviews for Granta magazine, a literary quarterly in England. And I was, the camp was kind of protected. So what I did is I sat in my hotel, and I got word in my way to people in the camp, and they started coming to me. And by the end of the first day, people were coming and saying, since finally a senator from the United States has come to hear our case, I want you to listen to mine. And I'm like, I'm really not a United States senator. I am a writer for a small literary quarterly in England. And they're like, we are so glad that you have come to bring our case to the world and that you will press our case so that the world will hear. I'm like, I don't know if anybody's going to hear. I really don't know. I would say pretty much the same thing when I'm writing for The New Yorker. Honestly, it's a much bigger circulation, and I know that more people will hear, but I am not going to tell somebody, you should tell me, if you want your problem solved, you should come to me, and I will amplify your voice, and your story as you want it told for an activist purpose is going to reach the ears of the powerful, and they will bend and, be persuaded. Maybe. I've seen that happen. I've seen things that I've written have some minor consequence here or there, but most of the time it's not the consequence that you had in mind, and I don't write that way. I do write for salvage at some level, which I think of as kind of the main activity of humankind, which is the collection of what is otherwise going to be lost, to pass it along to people. To keep things, that the more that's written down. But I have no sense of that as a direct... and I think that we sometimes tell ourselves these things to make it a little more meaningful or so, but I think we have to be very modest about what we're doing.
Wenn ich das aufnehmen darf.
If I may take this up, Yiwu, what Philip has just said, that he only understands the question or answers the question only when it is about writing something that would be lost otherwise. When I take your report, your testimony, report is not enough, your book on your time in Chinese prisons, is it something that Philip has just said, that you write, you tell the story of people in prison, also because you know that otherwise they would be lost, nobody would tell these stories? Was this also your idea, your drive to tell the stories on behalf of your co-mates in prison? I've written 3 books, and I was very afraid because awful things happened to me. I was tortured, and I was afraid that all this would be lost. That was one reason, that the whole story would be lost, that it would disappear like air going out of the window and it's no longer there. and nobody will know about it, then I had the impression I'd go mad. If you simply throw it away like waste. So there was another way. I had to write. Of course, you can imagine a potential reader. You simply imagine a theoretical reader to whom you direct your writing. If it's not a living reader, or if you imagine that somebody will read what you write, you might imagine you write for somebody who's in heaven. On the one hand, you wrote in a very impressive and disturbing way what violence you have suffered yourself in prison, in different prisons. You suffered the abuse by guards, but you also described or experienced and described the abuse among prisoners. There's a very important part of your book, I think, where you not only describe what you had to suffer and to bear, but when you also started under these circumstances to take up the stories of the other prisoners. How important was it also to record the stories of the others and share them with others?
Well, it was very important. But when I spoke about others, of course, in the book, there were others involved. So I did not just speak about my own experience. I updated with interviews with others. Or I updated the book with interviews from others. I can just agree with what Philip just said a minute ago. I also watched the film which Philip shot concerning Rwanda. And I was just deeply shocked to the bone. Rwanda was something that was a very remote place for me. And to see that such atrocities could happen in such a remote place, and that nothing happens at the international level was deeply devastating for me. When I watched the film on the massacre, although it was a remote place, it felt very close to me because it resembled a lot my day-to-day experience in practice, because it was untargeted dying, untargeted violence. It was meaningless. It didn't make any sense. It was irrational. This suffering or this experience was definitely something that was formative for me, just as formative as the experience for Philip was of what he watched in Rwanda. Well, the thing is, I'm not writing this down because I think it's so interesting for Germans or an American to read what's going on in China. It's like an inner motivation. I need to write it down. There's no other ways. So when we listen to that, it's like a search. First on the part of Philip, who tries to uncover these stories. He tries to document them, record them, carefully salvage them, make sure that they're not being lost. And what Yiwu said, that he suddenly has the impression that what he experienced during his incarceration would be lost other ways. So testimony is always evidencing what
in all these different languages at once.
What's lost otherwise? Okay.
I think what's important to note, first of all, that most witnesses will never testify, and most people will never be heard. And these are exceptional and really truly remarkable cases, and I really want to thank you also for your book and that you actually have taken the strength to write this. And that if you're asking me what, I would think what borne witness to is what was lost is the sense of being heard and recognized and having a community in which one can communicate to others who grasp and comprehend and register someone as another person who is communicating. So what testimony is also the attempt to recreate something that was lost. And the loss is material, is physical, is losing your loved ones, it is losing a certain innocence, it is losing a certain dignity, it is losing political rights, it is losing one's home, one's belonging, all of those things. But it's also losing this capacity or this very basic sense that you are being listened to or heard. So I think the testimony is also to this loss, and then the testimony becomes the effort to recreate that. And as Philip said, I don't believe that journalists actually are categories of witnesses. Secondary maybe, something like that, but there are other people who have survived things. And so when you're saying that, you are also carrying other people's stories, and you are, I think, what you're doing is trying to create, I assume, the sense of being heard. That is what testimony also has to do, and that is what testimony can mean, bearing witness to the loss of that, which is very fundamental and I think incredibly important. And this whole conference is, for my personal taste, very intense, and I don't spend my days actually usually listening to just incessant tales of atrocity, and there were moments in this conference when there was actually silence. And I slightly disagree with Philip, who said earlier, everything in the human experience is sayable and speakable and representable through language. There were actually moments when something wasn't said, and it's important to bear witness to that silence, which is sometimes the precondition for someone to be heard, because that's actually what you speak into, is a silence that then is met. So I actually think...
You just used words to describe that silence very well. I mean that. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't... That's all I meant by what I was saying.
I understand your impulse, but I also think there are other moments when what I actually think is important, there was in the panel prior to this one, there is sometimes something that occurs when people start listening. And start listening not for the sake of information, I want to understand this, I want to understand that, I want to get this theory. They listen. And they see that other person as holding a truth that is not your truth. And that is that person's testimony. And that is actually... that happens, there is silence there somewhere. So all I want to say is the loss is actually, maybe we can focus on that for the moment, that the loss is not all these other things which are terrible, tangible. But there's something else, which is to recreate this possibility of being listened to. That's what I think you're saying with your stories.
Falsche Seite. Wenn ich, es fiebt furchtbar.
Andere Seite.
Okay, ich habe ja auch glücklicherweise nur eine Frage, insofern muss ich gerade...
Sorry, I have a question, so... Yiwu. Now like to get back to what Ulrich just said. That was very important, and it tied in referred very closely to your books and your own experience. Ulrich Baer just said, there's lots of things which get lost by the wayside. And your bearing witness is always bearing witness to loss. And he mentioned inter alia, a loss of innocence. Would you subscribe to that? Do you think you lost your innocence, during your incarceration? Or what was it you lost during your incarceration? What was the main loss? My main loss? Well, actually, bearing witness to something, that's nothing new. People have doing this since time immemorial, despite catastrophes, and there are many things which were lost in the shrouds of history, and they can't be restituted. Okay. A couple of years ago, a film was shot on Rwanda, and people are devastated. But this will be lost too. people won't be that devastated any longer. So the remembrance, narration, history, what stays with us is just a speck of dust. It's just hardly anything. Maybe there are many people who read my memories from my times in prison, memoirs, and the Chinese say, okay, why did you write about it? That's just the way life is in prison. But I don't wonder about things that are lost, or whether something will be lost, or whether something won't be lost. I just have to write. And I thought, well, maybe, part of why I explain why I have such a positive feedback abroad is that life is different here. So it's this incongruence that makes people remember it, that it's not lost. But actually you feel almost like a deceased writer. You're very singular, you're very alone, you're left with your own memories, and you're at war with your own memories. Now, this kind of narration, like yours, concerning the experience in prison, in the Chinese prisons, can that kind of experience ever come to an end? Can you ever have this sense of closure? You wrote this very, moving, emotional, and fantastic book. And of course, the book came to an end. But did you find closure? Do you have the impression that your narration from this time and on this time can come to an end, that there is an end to that narration, that you have this sense of closure? Well, I don't know. I don't know whether I have a kind of final point or finish line. Maybe 2 years ago, the entire Bushela story came up again, and Wang Yijin, one of his cronies, went to Chengdu to the American embassy and took refuge there and released a lot of information, intelligence, concerning the internal procedures adopted in those prisons, and I was one of those who suffered at the hands of the regime. Of course, I was a political prisoner, and they were very cruel towards me, but they were also very, very cruel towards their own people. So not only towards the political prisoners. I was labeled a political activist. So the Communist Party adopted a very cruel approach to me personally. So personally, I think closure. I doubt that there will be a closure. I think it's part of human nature that there's that violent. No, I meant it differently. I didn't mean whether the violence will find a closure or will come to an end, or whether you have the impression that for yourself, the point has come, okay, I've done enough description, this is enough narration now, the chapter's over, and it's time to close the book and open a new chapter. So I didn't mean whether will the violence continue, but I meant will your own narration concerning that experience continue. I can just get back to what Philip just said a minute ago. Or rather, what he wrote about Rwanda. And he went to Vietnam and the Southeast Asian regions and interviewed people there. And that was actually unrelated to Philip himself. I mean, Philip is an American. He has his American life. The American life was good. His life was good. And he went there as an outsider, and he did this upon himself, although it was unrelated, and he still went there. He still had no... And I am Chinese. I myself am a Chinese, and I spoke or wrote about China as a Chinese. I wrote about intrinsic factors to do with my own psychology, with my own identity, things which are in my DNA, which are hardwired, which are inextricable. I think that's the difference. Would you subscribe to the assertion, or rather, let me put a question.
ideale Form
Is there an ideal form for describing violence or extreme situations?
würden Sie sagen, es gibt Ereignisse, für die
Would you say
bietet sich sozusagen das ausschließlich eher nüchtern
there are certain events which you can only describe in a very documentary manner, in a very sober, precise, analytic manner, observations, kind of clinical approach? Or are there certain experiences or events where you would say you need to adopt a different idiom? You need a more literary approach. You need to adopt a more narrative approach. Do you think there's different genres which match different experiences or events of extreme violence or extreme situations? So,
No, I don't think that there's one way to do it, or one form to do it in. It seems to me that Hieronymus Bosch and John Hersey and Jimi Hendrix guitar solos can all describe violence pretty well. And those are just three random examples, but I mean, I'm just saying it seems to me there might be forms that you would think like, that seems very unlikely until you see it. And then if it's done well, I mean, I think that the most difficult and ongoing challenge, whether it's one's own experience or whether it's others, is finding an original response to original circumstances and being able to give form to that. And if documentary is a way to do it, if overstatement is the way to do it, understatement's the way to do it, if burlesque is the way to do it sometimes with violence, a certain kind of grotesquerie, if you think about Ensor paintings or something like that, or certain kinds of theater, you know, where you really heap it on. You have, you know, you could also have very, very, very spare and abstract poetry that could get at something that would be unbelievably moving. And really said, silence. There are moments where, and I wasn't being glib when I said you described that well. I mean, I do think that's a form of, it's not words, but I think the words can describe the silence, or the way that silence can function in these things, because that is, I mean, there are many, many different forms, and I think that it would be a mistake to think that any subject, and in this I just think violence just isn't that different from the rest of human experience in that respect. You know, what's harder to describe, love or violence? Love. Almost certainly. That's why the great thing about it is you can just say they loved each other. And then if you make the rest of the story follow coherently from that premise, people will accept it. If you say they killed each other, well, then there's no story that goes next. But you know, if you say that there's some violence there, there's some need to account for that. But if the fact that two people love each other, however ridiculous and implausible that might seem, there's no need to account for it. It's much harder to explain. So violence is actually not such a difficult thing to find different forms for, I think.
Würden Sie sagen, dass Sie selber sich in Ihrer
would you dare say that you yourself, in your own work, in your own literary work,
lassen Sie sich selber die
leave yourself free rein
Fragen etwas
to
literarischer und vielleicht damit auch
either embark upon a more literary,
oder etwas
a more fictitious or more creative road, or do you force yourself,
in dem Sinne eben eher
discipline yourself to adopt a more traditional approach, truth, as opposed to authenticity?
sind Sie in Ihrem speziellen Beruf jetzt auch oder als
So how free are you in your specific profession or as an author to come up with, you know, a bit of imaginary or literary approaches?
Well, I'm quite free. I think that that doesn't mean that I've been exercising all that freedom. In other words, I have been working, certainly in my reportage, within the constraints, not so much of a convention, but the rules of factual writing. And I think that the big difference between, I mean, fiction and fact both have to be truthful. The difference is that fact is harder because it also has to be factual, which is a tremendous burden. And it means that you're limited also by what people actually say. There's so many times where somebody's telling you a story, even an incredibly moving story, incredibly well told, and you think, I could tell that just a little better. or I could compress that, or I could get rid of this absurd inconsistency if I were a fiction writer, right? Which doesn't actually illuminate it, it's just hanging there, and if I ignore it, it feels like I'm sort of dodging something that's there. There are all kinds of problems that factual writing, also, there are bits of information you just can't get. You know, you get all this stuff, and then there's this little thing there. Well, a fiction writer, no problem, you make something up. You know, and it's something that's you can't just make something up, you can't just have a pink rabbit fall out of the sky and stitch those two things together and say, ha! See, fiction. You know, it has to be cohesive. It has to be coherent. It has to follow the emotional and narrative logic of the whole thing. It has to actually carry that truth much further. But working within the constraints of a basic kind of fact checkability, where you're saying, this is what this person said, as opposed to, I know that the thing that person said is true, and therefore I can develop it that way. That's just a set of rules that I've chosen to play with as a formal set of constraints. Within that, there's a huge amount of room to write. And there are a huge amount of things that get frustrating.
Wie unwahr
How untrue
werden die Geschichten, die
do stories become?
Sie genannt haben, set of constraints.
How untrue?
How untrue? Yes.
Does what? Does factual writing become?
Yeah.
Oh, I've always wanted to write a perfectly fact-checkable story that has no truth in it at all. Just to sort of as an experiment. I've never, but I mean, facts aren't necessarily like all that interesting or informative sometimes. You know, there are a lot of factual assertions you can make that don't actually add up to anything very interesting, but they're true, you know, or they're factual. And so could you write a fact-checkable story where every single statement, an assertion of fact is true, but is factual, but the basic thing is like nonsense? Probably. That's what lawyers, I think, get paid for a lot of the time. But I think that probably, you know, my effort is not to do that. My effort, I mean, my effort is within those constraints and according to that thing to describe it as truly as possible. And you know, how do you test that? Well, one way is when you actually have the people you're writing about read it.
Yeah.
And in some cases, you can do that very straightforwardly. All of the people in the thing are going to read the thing. Other times, some of the people are, right? I have never had a meaningful, significant objection from somebody I wrote about to whether or not they said it. I've had people lose their jobs because they said things to me that I reported them saying and said they were jerks who should be fired because they said this, and they were. But the guy didn't say he didn't say it. He didn't say I tricked him or misled him. He just kind of said like, whoa, that guy walked in, I talked like I always do, and he put it in the paper. You know, that's different. So you know, that's an objection. But if you really over time are careful, and that's a real constraint. It's a much bigger constraint than some sort of abstract notion of factuality. Is, am I writing something here where, because you have to select and you have to leave certain things out and emphasize other things, that's going to make that person in any way that they've represented to me be able to come at me and say like, right? And that's it's important. And over time, you start to get a pretty good sense of how to measure those things. So it's important to me that there's not that distortion. That it takes a form they never would have thought of, that you weigh in different people. You know, one of the things that happens when you report a story, which is different, and it's not totally different even from parts of memoir. If you're collecting stories, if you're listening to the people around you, you know more about certain stories than anybody in them. Right? When I did a cold case, a murder case, I talked to all the people. They never talked to each other. So I had all their different versions in my head, which they didn't know. In the end, I'm going to write that down. They're going to see it. It's going to take a form that is none of their individual forms. It's my form, the thing that I did with it.
I want to jump into this. And I write fiction also, which is not very easy, actually. But I wanted to say two things. First of all, it's actually probably a phenomenon of today that someone would say, which I totally agree to, that any genre would be permissible to tell something about an atrocity or war. That used to not be sort of accepted. There used to be standards, and people would say burlesque is not an acceptable means of representing certain types of suffering. We've had huge debates for decades over this. And it's
but when is, honestly, like when is used to? I mean, you mean like
No,
in
I think
the
now
last
it's-
few decades or in the last few centuries?
In the last few decades, actually more than the last few centuries.
Right,
The
okay.
second thing I would want to say is that it is not always true that the most novel form, the most original way of representing someone's own story is the best way to do it, but sometimes it's very important to rely on existing traditions and genres. And there are many traditions: the prison narrative, the survivor narrative, certain types of plays, certain types of figures, certain types of personal losses that we're familiar with, certain types of gestures in pictures, certain types of photographs that you can recognize almost intuitively because people tend to read human gestures very readily. You can understand something in an image very easily if there's a gesture involved that everybody has already done, him or herself. So the genre that actually is used to tell a story that in the first instance is unbelievable to others, and what we were talking about earlier, that there is no reception, no one wants to listen to it, and you're like the only person on the planet who tells that story, then there's exaggeration may be necessary. Maybe you fictionalize something because you want to get attention, you want to be heard, but you want to be heard in a way that people are familiar with hearing something. So on the one hand, you have to respond to the circumstances, as you're saying. On the other hand, you also want to move in a tradition that people are familiar with because they don't want to be confronted with an event, an experience, an occurrence they've never encountered, plus a form they've never encountered. And then those forms have to be established. And in American music, hip-hop music testifies to the suffering of young black men in American cities. But that had to be established over 30 years. When it came out first, people could not understand what that was about. So you're creating a genre over time. And I think it's very important that many testimonies end up sounding quite a bit like other testimonies because they have to rely on existing traditions. And all of you have this experience, probably, reporters. You hear one story, you hear 10 stories, you hear 50 stories, and they start sounding a bit like other stories you've heard. That's because people have been successful in communicating something. So there's a tension in the idea of testimony that on one hand, you try to find the genre, the way of speaking or depicting that's new and true to this event, which is unprecedented for you at least. At the same time, you want to rely on a way of communicating that is shared in a community, in a certain tradition. And that's what's interesting would be, for example, there may be culturally specific ways of telling a story. You tell your story in this country in a different way than you would tell it in another country or culture or context.
Wenn ich dazu mal eine recht banale Bemerkung machen darf.
If I may, something banal. My father comes from Schleswig-Holstein, and
A region of Germany.
North.
it's a region in the north of Germany. And he says, we talk little in summer, and at winter we don't talk at all. So if there are cultural circumstances of the genre, I'm not a typical child of my father. So if I take up what both Philip and Ulrich Baer said, and Yiwu, to you, you are both a writer and also a witness, and you document stories of others in China. You're also a musician and a poet. You have the linguistic gift to use different forms of narration. And the special feature of your testimony of Chinese prisons was, at least to me, that you use a very poetic language. It's not just a documentary report, even though the German translation has it in the subtitle. It's called The Report of a Witness. And you read the book, and it's full of poetic association, full of metaphors. It uses very strong images, which are very touching and may have made it more accessible to me. So I would like to know, when you wrote it, the question which we discussed, how documentary, how factual, exact is it? Was it important to you, or was it important to tell the inner truth of this place and the inner truth of the people with whom you suffered? People tell me before they are executed, they told me I was the last one to listen to them. And people who executed others told me how they did this because it was a burden to them. And ones who fled the prison, they told me how they did it. But he told me this various times, and the second time he told me something different. And if they tell me the story 10 times, again and again, they're very obsessive in telling the stories. And then I realized that they tell the story a different way, and then I'm fed up with listening to it. And then they say, well, you're the last one to listen to me. Tomorrow I will be shot. And I have to tell you this story. To whom else can I tell this? And when I heard this, then I never said, or I had the feeling that I was a writer. I had the feeling I'm a passive recorder who's simply there to record the sins in a very passive way. And then this device myself recorded everything, how somebody jumped across the wall, or how somebody did human trafficking, how somebody sold a woman. And then he told me the story again. And then I was quite surprised the second time. Well, and I said, first you said you sold the woman in this town, and now it's a different town. It's the same story. What are you telling me? And that this person is very creative, a very creative storyteller. And was looking for somebody to tell the story. And if you simply portrayed this in uncommented way, in a very documentary way, people would go mad. So as a writer, you also have to be creative to capture it and to create a certain logic for the reader. Without this in mind, it wouldn't make any sense, and it would be silly what you write. It wouldn't make any sense. If I'm proud to be a creative writer, to give this sense. For the audience, could you tell us something what was lost in a very practical sense? Liao Yiwu, your manuscript in which you had recorded your experience in the witnesses was seized several times. I think we should share this information. Your first manuscript had 300,000 Chinese signs. I'm not familiar with Chinese, so I can only guess how big it was. And you wrote this text again and again. You had to write the text again and again. The manuscript was seized, it was taken away from you, and you started again to write the story out of prison. Could you tell us what changed with a new version, with a new attempt to write the story? The first time, the first version, I was still closer to prison. I had just left prison. And then my impression was that it had happened yesterday. And I was quite fast in writing everything very quickly. Within 1 year, I wrote these 300,000 Chinese signs, and then it was taken away by the police. I was devastated and without any hope. But there was another option. I had to do it again, because I still had the feeling that I hadn't written everything, and that is why I had to write again. And second version, I included things that hadn't come to my mind in the first version, which came to mind. I said, well, yes, exactly. I should also write this, but other details didn't come to my mind, so they were truly lost. And when I wrote the third version, I was really tired and was frustrated and had really an aversion to write this again. And then very slowly, I came out of this feeling writing it, and slowly I recalled details which I had lost in the second version. So they came up when I wrote the third version. And very horrific details I was able to write down. It was very unpleasant to be confronted with them again. It was no pleasure. But it was the suffering. And if you deal with suffering, it's not a pleasure, but you have to do it. Well, when I wrote the first version, I didn't have a computer. I had to write everything by hand. And it's better if you write on a computer and you can store it on various CDs and you can hide the CDs. Then you're safe, and it's a good feeling to be safe. When we hear how the conscience changes while you write and how the text has changed through these different versions, is bearing witness, not only in this very concrete case, but in more general terms, is it rather reconstructive or constructive? Does bearing witness work more with memories or more with imagination?
Probably more constructive. I would think that testimony as such doesn't exist before it is made, before it is given, before it is written. And that you wrote it 3 times actually means it didn't exist each time again. It was lost, so it has to be constructed actually. It's not that it's there. And then it's interesting when you said you're a human tape recorder, and then you write it down, but it's very difficult. It's not automatic, and you just put it on paper or on a computer, and there it is. You have to create it. And what I said much earlier, sort of what you've been saying, what Philip has been saying, you're creating this text, you're creating this testimony, and you're creating the possibility of being heard. This is a creative act. I don't really think the term fantasy would be useful, but it's part of the imagination. You have to imagine. It's imagining also things that don't seem very easily imaginable, and you have to, and that's what writing is. A lot of it is actually imagining a lot more than what you actually end up writing, because what Philip said earlier, whether you write factual or fictional texts, you're imagining an entire web and network of meaning, which is what we call the world and relations and all that. And a lot of this doesn't go into what you're writing, but you have to imagine all this other stuff so it makes sense. So I think the making sense that you're saying, you said you're, duly somewhat proud to have made sense of something that didn't make sense until you actually put it into writing. So I think that it's a creative act, and I would say creative then for factual writing, nonfiction. Those distinctions to me seem more important for people who put books on bookshelves or something like that, or in some internet search system. It's creative, yes, it's a creative act even to turn facts into nonfiction, right? and it's creative to write fiction. So I think it's a construction, but I wouldn't put that in a category of and therefore unreliable, therefore invented, therefore fantasy, therefore made up, therefore in the department of literature and in the little section called poetry, the one story in the New Yorker that gets printed every week versus the other really important stuff. This is not the useful distinction. What you are both talking about, you are creating something that is then in a different vocabulary for us. It's a speech act. It's not a passive just transcription. So that's why I would say creative, then to your two terms, not fantasy in this kind of slightly dismissive way of, I made this up. Much earlier you said something really moving, and you said, if I hadn't told my story, I would have thought I was going to go crazy. That fantasy is actually then, that's a lot of people actually have been accused throughout time of having borne witness that you're crazy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're making this up. And there are different figures for this craziness, and there are different labels. You're a child, you're a woman, you're a madman, you're infantilized in a certain way, you're a certain minority. This is all figures for the same idea, that you're crazy, you don't belong in our system of making meaning. That's what testimony is. It challenges a whole set of systems. So fantasy is not to be used as this is bad. Fantasy is quite important. The imagination is quite an important and powerful instrument because it challenges the way the world has been constructed to exclude that part. So.
Eine Frage, die auch
a question which we thought again and again during this content for Bunting, Gruger and myself when we set up the program was when we looked for writers or filmmakers who report on these extreme experience of violence, that we realized there's some kind of narratives came up only after a very long period of time. There was a guest who was here today, somebody whom I would like to have met, Liao Yiwu, Karl Marlantes, an American Vietnam veteran who took 30 years to write his book, which became a novel, or was called a novel, in which he shared his or described his experience in the Vietnam War. So he didn't write it and started again and again, or there wasn't a period of 10 years where he didn't write. So apparently he wrote for 30 years this book, and he tried to find out how to write this story. And with history in mind, if we think about what these timelines mean, what kind of testimonies we know. So I think of two types. Primo Levi, who immediately, on his way home in Italy, started to speak, to write, tried to tell the story. Jean Omery, who needed a very long time, a time of silence, as he called it. I would like to ask the two of you, or the three of you, about the meaning of this time distance. Yiwu, you said you had to write, you felt the urge to write, you wanted to tell the story immediately. Could you tell us what was this urgency about? And are there still things which you have not yet told, of which you'd say, time's not yet ripe? I can't tell them.
Yeah, there are quite a few things which I can't write yet. Well, for a song and 100 songs, I was in danger, in imminent danger. or actually, sorry, the danger was that it would be forgotten altogether, and if I wasn't writing it down quickly enough, then that it would be taken too long, and that it would be taken away from me in the last moment by the police. So I was under strong pressure. I had to do something. Apart from that, I was under psychological duress. It was a psychological exercise for me. It helped me come to term. It was a healing exercise. I was healing myself through writing. And I must say, although it was taken away from me for three times over, the script, psychologically, I'm much better off now. And it was also a learning process. I learned to find out how the others are doing. I learned through writing. I learned to look at older people, to observe them, to watch them, to see how they fared. And I looked at, for instance, an old man, and I said, well, actually, he has probably been through much worse, and I'm so young. I've got the power to write it down, and he's probably much worse off than myself. I'm better off than him, and I can take care of the others and absorb a bit of their suffering and heal myself by writing about their suffering too. So it's a kind of therapy. It's a writing therapy. It became a kind of habit, custom or professional habit of mine. Of course, I can't say I'm doing this for the others. I'm doing it for myself. I need to write it down. I've got no proof whether the others are ever going to hear it. Now, concerning the temporal distance, can you say something about the temporal distance? You wrote a book about Rwanda. I read it. Unfortunately, I was not allowed to read it yet, or I couldn't even get a sneak preview. And yeah, I heard that you are already working on another book of Rwanda. Could you talk about the temporality, the distance, the time distance? What does it do to the stories? I mean, using the specific example of Rwanda.
I don't think of it as already writing another. I mean, it's 20 years since the genocide, and I wrote the first book relatively soon afterwards. I started going a year after the killing in 1995, and the book came out in 1998, and I wrote a number of pieces along the way. So I was writing at that point fairly quickly in response to my reporting. I mean, as I collected stories, I tended to write them. And in fact, there are chapters in the first book that basically consist of unmailed emails, because I had no email connection, that I would write them as almost like emails when I would, at the end of a day in Rwanda. So I sat down and just sort of, would write like I was talking to somebody, this happened today, and I would just, and very little editing ended up going on in those. So there was a lot that I wrote as I went along. The journals or the notebooks, which are a mixture of transcribing what I wrote by hand at the end of the day and then typing up other things, contained like about 4 or 5 books. And some of that stuff I'm still mining from those first trips. These days I take very few notes. I write very little down, other than when I'm interviewing people. I don't know why.
What is your guess?
I'm just old and creaky. Well, part of it is the excess accumulation of stuff. If I've got 5 volumes of unmined, unpublished, why do I want to create 5 more volumes of unmined, unpublished notebooks? And that might sound crazy, but there is a certain sense of the cosmic futility of the whole collecting exercise. And also, I think, because I've started using a tape recorder more, because I'm trying to be more precise with certain aspects of speech with people, but it means that I'm writing less as I'm sitting in front of people. I'm finding it generally, I started going back, I should say, in 2009, and I went once in 2000. In the interval, I really stayed only quite distantly in touch. I kept track of things. I never dipped in deep. And I didn't want to particularly. I felt like I wasn't particularly productive when I did. I mean, I wasn't able to look at it afresh in any way. And I went back in part because Rwanda had, for all of its many, many, many ongoing troubles and weaknesses and dilemmas, it had achieved a level of basic stability and coexistence and sort of turning certain corners that were simply unavailable to the imaginations of any of us who were there at the time. One of the things I'm mining from my first round of notebooks are encounter after encounter after encounter with people who are like, this place cannot last a year. You know, the total conviction that it would blow up again along roughly the same lines, much, much worse. And that there was really no putting it back together again. So the fact that some of these things, in no final form, obviously, but that some of these things have begun to be dealt with was interesting. And it occurred to me that it might even be a slightly less grim story to write. Fool that I was. I went over and started collecting the stories, and I realized that one of the ways that people were dealing with this was by confronting each other. That through these communal trials and so forth, the stories that before I would hear somebody say, yes, that guy across the street, he killed 14 people in my family. Now I could go and I could get the transcript of that guy's Gacaca trial, not the transcript, but the handwritten record. I could get that translated. I could go to the guy. I could bring that in there, and all of a sudden, every graphic detail starts coming out. Exactly what I least wanted to deal with, which is the sort of revisiting of the extreme brutality, and yet it's the only way that they got through it, right? In other words, the only way to actually agree that they've had this encounter and that some kind of truth and some sort of thing was for this. So the whole reconciliation project was based on this kind of crazy re-traumatization, and it's very unclear what was entirely achieved. But it meant that I, as a writer, was suddenly working with material that I had not at all expected to be dealing with when I went over there, and finding myself having to deal with a level of graphic detail that I had avoided the first time around. Avoided because, partly deliberately, I thought, I want to make this a non-repellent book about a repellent subject. I want to actually make it so that you're not constantly being grossed out, but that you're actually being made, to your surprise, able to read about trauma and a complexity that has a political element and a social element, all this stuff. And now here I am with this very, very nitty-gritty, extremely detailed, including the testimonies of the killers about how they killed, and the testimony of the survivors about exactly how people were killed. And that is something that only happened because of time. In other words, nobody was going to tell you that at the beginning. And it's not that it hurts less now, it's that it simply went through a certain kind of process by now. And I know what you were saying earlier about testimonies having forms and so forth, but one of the interesting things about it is the earlier form got broken, right? So they suddenly are like into this whole extra level of detail. And then they start to, they don't really want to go back over it past. Once they've done that a few times, it's like too much. And so it's a very complicated thing that's happened with time there that I find slows the whole thing down.
Can I jump into this idea of time? And much earlier, you asked whether the loss of innocence. I'm thinking of fictional literature now, not documentary, sort of nonfiction writing. And writing creates time, actually. It slows down things in a way, it speeds up things, it gives us the space to reflect. I had a very odd experience. I edited a book after 9/11 with 110 writers, called 110 Stories, since the World Trade Center had 110 stories. I'm very proud of this book because I didn't write it. And 110 people wrote it, and it's a very odd book, and there were people in there from very different parts of New York, someone who trained to be a mujahideen, one of my friends who was a US Marine. I always thought those people would be on the same subway car in New York City, but they're not in the same world. The poets had written things like this, literally like this. That morning, 9:15, they had a poem done. The fiction writers took a year to hand in whatever they needed to write. Fiction was slower to do. That's one thing, that's interesting. What you're just saying, actually, I think there's an element of we write to create hope. we actually tell these stories for the future, for a future in which one can still talk about something that wasn't possible, that some things were not, and you're saying the trials, reconciliation, these attempts to tell these stories, to create something of a whatever that's supposed to have an effect. There is that hope, and I think it's a restoration of hope in a way. That's what writing is also, and writing is always directed at the future. And I think that's an important part. I think fiction writers allow for those kind of sentimental cliches much more readily, maybe. I think reporters are a bit more hard-boiled and have deadlines and all those things, probably. But I actually think it's important to put that at the heart of the question of what is testimony. And it's not just to establish this happened, that happened, this is the correct version of history. It's actually about something else. It's about allowing for a future to happen.
Wenn ich das aufnehmen darf und
One of the things I have over my desk while I'm writing this is just hope is overrated, which was a line I found in one of my notebooks.
Well, Kafka said there's an abundance of it, but not for us.
Right, well, I just thought, I don't know that I write to create hope. I have never had fully that experience. Pleasure, maybe.
Wenn ich trotzdem den Gedanken aufnehmen darf,
May I just get back to
Ulrich Baer und sagen darf, es gibt sozusagen
to
verschiedene
Ulrich's
Richtungen
notion,
der
who
Zeugenschaft. Wir haben jetzt
said
stark
there are
immer
different directions of
Aufzug in Richtung die Vergangenheit
bearing
uns
witness, and you
konzentriert.
can
Wenn
have
wir
the
sagen,
direction
wir
of the
gehen auch in die
past, you
Richtung
can
der
be focused on the
Zukunft,
past, but you can also
würde
focus
ich ganz gerne
hope
über
on the
Poetic
future.
Justice zum
And therefore,
Schluss
last but not least, let's
sprechen. Und die
all talk about
Frage
poetic
an
justice, right?
Yiwu
I mean,
stellen,
and question to Yiwu.
gibt es auch
Is there,
mit Ihrem Erzählen, mit Ihrem Aufschreiben dieser
you know, when
Geschichten,
you write these
der Erfahrungen
stories,
in
the
chinesischen
experience in
Gefängnissen,
Chinese jails,
ist das auch so
when you
etwas wie
write
der
down these
Versuch,
stories, is
ja,
this an
vielleicht nicht die
attempt
Vergangenheit zu korrigieren,
not to correct
aber
the past,
sozusagen
but
dieser Erfahrung eine
to
Gegengeschichte, ein
give a
Gegenentwurf,
counter story, a counter
sozusagen
draft,
gegenüberzustellen,
a Gegenbild
in der man
to this
sieht.
Experience where you are
Eine Geschichte,
victorious,
in der
where
die Täter,
after
die
all
Ihnen
you're
das
still the winner,
angetan
because the
haben und vielen
perpetrators who did
anderen
this
Menschen
unto you
antun,
and upon you and
nicht
do the
siegen, eben weil sie
again
ihre Sprache behalten
onto
haben,
many
weil
others
sie,
are not
weil sie
victorious
diese
because
Geschichte
you kept
geschrieben
your
haben.
language,
Gibt es
because you
etwas?
still have a voice, you can write the story. Is that a kind of, you know, being victorious in the end?
其实我现在只要我把它给写下来了，然后就成为
As a matter of fact,
就是一本书，就说一个或许它可以留下
I
来的
wrote it
这么
down
一
and
个
it
东西
turned out to be a book,
其实
to
我
become
现
a
在
book.
脑子
And the
里
book
面
is
经常
something
回忆
which
的
may remain.
是我
But
教我
whatever's
推销
in
的
my
那个
head
和尚，我曾经写了一篇关于学销的文章，就让
Whatever
我
I
就是
think of myself,
直
you
到
know, I
现在
see
还在
myself as an old
回
monk
忆它。
plying his
他当时
pipe,
就是说，
his
这个
flute.
监狱，
So
就
it's
说人生
like,
就
you
是一
know,
个
that's the
监
kind of
狱，
image I have of myself.
只能说监狱外面的人呢，做那种没有墙的监狱。
The way in which I see
在监狱
myself.
里面的无外乎
So
就是
actually,
有
any
墙的
person,
监狱
man,
而已，
is always
他就
in
保持了他
prison.
的那么一种平静。
And if you're in a real prison, you're just surrounded by walls. But actually, if in your life as a human being, you are imprisoned.
只有从自己的内心去找
You're
这个事。
imprisoned in the prison of your
然后
life.
他
You're
就
always
通
in prison.
过然后
This is also
随这
something
个
which I
消，
learned
然后
from
就
somebody
不
who
停地
was in prison
不停地
with
回
me.
想，那么就说
And
恢复了
he
我身上的
kept
那
playing
么
his
一点
flute,
诗
and
意。
I learned
这个诗意呢，可能就是我早
the
年
flute
那
from
个
him.
青春冲动
And
和那受垮
This is
掉
not
一
the
代
only thing I learned from
影响
him.
到
I
那种
mean,
诗
what
意
he
不一样。
said really
它
left
是
a
一
deep
种
impression on me,
淡淡的，但
created
是
this kind of
回味
poetic
非常
justice
在脑子里
impulse
面老是
incentive
回旋
in
的
me.
这么
Actually, it sounds very simple. Sounds almost banal. Or tasteless, whatever. But it really helped me. I found it really helpful.
Hat Liao Yiwu selber schon
Now,
das Bild
Liao Yiwu already
des
gave us an
Flöte
image,
spielenden
a
Mönchs
flute playing
erwähnt.
monk.
Nun darf ich sagen, wir haben Liao Yiwu gebeten,
And I may say,
ob
when we
für uns
asked
heute
Liao
Abend
Yiwu
hier
whether
selber
he
auch
would be
musizieren
prepared
würde.
to play the flute for us
Ich
or
habe
to
lange darüber nachgedacht
play
und
music
hab's,
for us. I thought about it long and hard, and I did not tell Antje
dass
Gröbner,
das
the
mein
co-curator,
Wunsch ist,
in advance that this
etwas,
is my
das
wish.
ich sozusagen
This
meinem
is something
Co-Kurator schenken möchte.
that I want to give as a
Und
present to my
gleichzeitig glaube ich,
co-curator
für uns alle, die
as
wir
a
diese
gift.
3 Tage hier
And
miteinander erlebt
last but not
haben
least, I
und
mean, all of us
unglaublich viel
who spent the last
nachgedacht und
3 days with
gesprochen
each other
haben
and
miteinander.
thought, take home lots of food
wüsste
for
nicht,
thought
wie
and spend lots of
Valentin und ich
time
ein
mulling
Schlusswort
things
sprechen
over. I
könnten
don't know
nach
how we
diesen
could
Tagen.
possibly wrap these
Bitte
3
sehen Sie es uns
days
nach,
up,
dass wir Sie
Valentin
nicht
and myself. So
sozusagen
please
einfach
bear
mit einem
with
Brief
us
oder einer
that we
These
just
entlassen,
don't just send you home with a take-home
ich
message,
bin
but
unglaublich
perhaps
dankbar
just a
und
few
wahnsinnig stolz, dass Liao Yiwu,
notes. I'm very
für
proud. I'm
uns,
very, very
diese
grateful to
Art
Liao
von
Yiwu and that
Schlusswort
he
übernehmen
will
wird, indem er
kind of
musiziert. Liao Yiwu.
give us the final wrap-up statement by giving us his music. Thank you. Over to you, Liao Yiwu. Caroline, thank you so much. Caroline, thank you so much. So for a couple of very, very exciting days, very thought-provoking days. And I should like to ask Christina Nord to join me up front because I don't want to take this thing like this is our film curator. So Christina, are you there? So everybody, let's come up front. So thanks for listening. Thanks for putting your questions. Thanks for this intensity, kind of. Because I hardly came across an audience at an event which helped us carry different, very heterogeneous events and, you know, made them come to life. And on this note, enjoy the weekend. Thank you very, very much.